So the first presentation, anyone who was in on the original webinar with Nora Stewart from Sproul, these slides are going to look very familiar. They're a good overview of basically everything that's going to be covered in the next 3 or 4 days. So I wanted to start with that. I'm sure I'll have a little bit of a different spin on Nora, so hopefully it's a little bit of new information for the people who've already gone through it. Pretty much everything that's in this presentation is going to be revisited in more detail later on. So this is really just to give you a high-level overview of what we're going to be discussing over the next several days. So we'll talk a little bit about the stakeholders, why we have the evaluation guidance and regulatory standards in North America and throughout the world. We'll look at a little bit of a comparison. This presentation really focuses on Canada and the US, a little bit of Australia. We'll talk at a very high level about definitions. The rest of today is going to be spending a lot of time on reserves and resource definitions, so this is, again, just a brief introduction. We'll compare the disclosure standards between SEC and NI 51-101. And we'll talk about some conclusions. So oil and gas, as you all know, is pretty pervasive throughout the world. It's everywhere. There are a lot of different jurisdictions that are dealing with the same issues that you guys are trying to nail down right now. How do we evaluate oil and gas assets? How do we determine the reserves that are in the ground and put a value on them? And how do we get companies or organizations to disclose those reserves and resource quantities and values in a way that makes sense and makes it easy for central organizations or stakeholders to understand. As you can see, throughout the world, you've got Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. Australia has been dealing with a lot of oil and gas in the last 15 or 20 years, so they've really come a long ways. Alberta, we've got the ASC, the Alberta Securities Commission, and the Canadian Standards, which sort of Canada really takes its guidance from Alberta, and the Canadian Standards Association takes the Alberta guidance and sort of applies it across the country. And she's listed Hong Kong. Obviously there's organizations in pretty much every country in the world, such as MRPAM, that are dealing with these same issues. I guess one other thing, the responsibility of regulators is really to protect the investment community or the public, to make sure that oil and gas companies are properly disclosing volumes. There are certain standards in place to protect people from capital investment and from securities exchanges. Outside of the regulators, there's a second group of companies that spends a lot of time talking about evaluations, definitions, best practices. That's associations like Petroleum Engineers, the Society of Petroleum Evaluation Engineers, APEGA, they're all over the world. AAPG is the geologists throughout the world, but mostly in North America. And really there, where the regulators are focusing on protecting stakeholders, these guys are focusing on determining best practices and really getting guidance on the best way to evaluate oil and gas assets and try to mitigate some of the uncertainty and risk associated with them. So again, a lot of this is what we're going to be talking about, especially the bolded portions. That's what we're really going to be spending the next 2 days on. SEC and Regulation SK, those are the disclosure standards for the New York Stock Exchange, regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission. NI 51-101, that's the Canadian guidance equivalent to Regulation SK, so that's what we use in Canada. You can see London Stock Exchange, Competent Persons Reports, Australia Listing Rules Chapter 5. So again, this is globally, everyone's trying to figure out a reasonable or best way to get companies to disclose their information. In terms of the guidance, we'll be talking about the Petroleum Resources Management System and the Canadian Oil and Gas Evaluation Handbook. You can see there are other classifications throughout the world. Everyone has, since sort of the early 1900s, everyone has been trying to determine the best practices for evaluating assets, and so everyone has sort of taken some sort of stab at it, and now we're finally starting to get to a point where we're getting standardized international guidance and guidelines where more and more countries are starting to adopt very similar systems for oil and gas. So why are we talking about North American standards? As I'm sure Nora went through, we have two of the largest stock exchanges in the world for oil and gas assets. So the Canadian exchange, you can see we have a lot of companies on the TSX and TSX Venture. This is saying just itself with 300 oil and gas companies that are subject NI 51-101 and CODI practices. On the flip side, if you're looking at value, everything is trumped by the New York Stock Exchange. All of the largest players in the global E&P companies are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and they will be subject to SEC and Regulation S-X. So the two stock exchanges basically outpace pretty much every other stock exchange in the world for either number of oil and gas companies or the size of the oil and gas companies. So if we start looking into how everything is related to guidance documents versus the regulatory requirements, etc. In Canada, it's a fairly straightforward system. We have the Canadian Oil and Gas Evaluation Handbook, which provides the guidance for how to evaluate reserves and resources, and some guidance on how to disclose it and best corporate practices for doing so. That's tied in directly to NI 51-101. So NI 51-101 directly references you and says any public company that wants to disclose their oil and gas assets has to do an evaluation that is CODI compliant. So they are directly tied. The regulatory body that controls or reviews the disclosure is the Alberta Securities Commission and the Canadian Standards. So they are all directly interrelated. In the U.S., like I said, most of the largest companies in the world, largest public oil and gas companies in the world are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Internally, they all reference PRMS for their evaluation procedures internally. So it's pretty standard for companies to be using the Petroleum Resources Management System. The difference between USA and Canada is that there is no direct link between the guidance that most companies are implementing internally and what is required by the Securities Exchange Commission. So in the US, the SEC has its own guidance in a document called Regulation S-K, which from a very high level says how you have to evaluate assets and disclose them. But it doesn't specifically reference PRMS. So there's nothing in the SEC system that says you have to do a PRMS compliant evaluation. So that's why there's sort of a fundamental difference between Canada and the US. Just as a reference, PRMS also used in Australia, but the difference in Australia from the US is that in their Chapter 5, they do specifically reference PRMS. So Australian companies have to use PRMS for their disclosure purposes, whereas companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange were subject to SEC control do not. So, and again, in the US, the SEC is the watchdog for disclosures, so they're the ones that are keeping an eye on what companies are putting in the public domain, requesting additional information when needed, making sure everyone is disclosing according to their S-K regulations. Australia has the same thing, ASIC and ASA. So again, highlighting highlighted guidance documents. So the ones in red are the three guidance documents that we're kind of going to be talking about: CODI, PRMS, and S-K. No matter where we're talking about, in most jurisdictions, this box is called the McKelvey box. Almost all oil and gas guidance has some version of this. It may not be identical. PRMS, CODI, S-K, they all reference this exact box, so this is consistent across all of them. But even if you move into Russian, Chinese, pretty much every system has a classification box that is similar to this. They may have different terminology, different names, but the general theme and how volumes are classified is very consistent. So we're going to be talking a lot about this box in the next, well, especially today. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you can see you've got uncertainty on the horizontal axis and essentially commercial risk on the vertical axis. So you've got prospective resources, contingent resources, and reserves in a hierarchy. That's fairly easy to. When we get into a little bit more detail, we have subclassifications for within each box, reserve, contingent, prospective resources, how the volumes inside those boxes can be further defined and further categorized into bins based on essentially their chance of commerciality, or how close they are to being developed, or how certain they are for being developed. This comparison, again, we'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow, but it's showing you that PRMS and CODI, while there are minor differences, they are very much in alignment. So the three evaluation standards, CODI, PRMS, and SEC. So we're again talking about guidance here. This is looking at the certainty categories, so 1P or proved reserves, 2P, which is probable or proved plus probable, and 3P, which is proved plus probable plus possible. In terms of the definitions, you can see the lowest point on all these. You can see that the quantitative numbers across all three are identical. So in terms of probabilistic evaluations, which is what those numbers apply to, all three are identical. You got your P90 is your proved, your P50 is your proved plus probable, and your P10 is your proved plus probable plus possible. So that's identical for probabilistic evaluations. The majority of evaluations that you'll see in the world are deterministic for the most part, and that's where these vary just slightly. You can see CODI says you have a high degree of certainty. PRMS and SEC say reasonable certainty with a high degree of confidence, which seems very small in terms of the difference, but I can tell you in North America there's a lot of discussion about SEC evaluations versus Canadian evaluations and how proved reserves are treated. So the minor differences in verbiage can result in large differences in how they're actually implemented. The rest are all fairly similar. At the end of the day, the intent is the same. The way that the guidelines were written, they all meant to say the same thing. The way that they were implemented through the regulatory procedures caused people to use a slightly different implementation based on the minor change in verbiage. All right, so looking at the disclosure, so the guidance documents, as we've already talked about a few times, Canada, CODI, the US, SEC, Regulation SK, and the ASX is using PRMS. The disclosure guideline in I-51-101, Regulation S-K and S-X in the US, Chapter 5 in Australia. So one of the biggest differences between the disclosure guidelines in the US and Canada is the price. So under the SEC, they ask companies to report their reserves volumes under a constant price case. There's another slide, just a few slides forward, that I'll go into a little bit more detail, but that is a difference between the US and Canada, and it makes a big difference as to what they're trying to accomplish with their disclosure guidance. Required volumes, the other major difference. Canada, Australia, so PRMS and CODI both say you should always start with the best estimate, and you should always have a range of uncertainties. You should always have, in Canada and Australia, most of them say 1P and 2P, most of them say you should have proved reserves and proved plus probable reserves at a minimum. In the US, they only require disclosure of proved reserves, and that's another one of those, that's the major reason that the definitions that we talked about on the last slide, proved, cause an issue, because the U.S. focuses entirely on proved reserves, and that's all companies, it's not all they're allowed to disclose. They can also disclose probable and possible if they choose to, but most companies do not, and because the precedent has been set, almost all U.S. companies in the New York Stock Exchange get compared on a proved reserve basis, which causes companies to really focus on proved reserves and sort of treat them as the only estimate that matters in turn. So going the value, the last bar down there is really talking about the intent of the regulation guideline. So again, going back to constant prices versus forecast prices and why it's a big deal. Canadian disclosure guidelines allow companies to use any price forecast that's reasonable as long as they disclose what it is. And you can see here, this is WTI forecast. You can see the difference between constant price, which is the green bar. That's what the SEC is going to require companies to disclose under. So for the next 10, 20, 50 years, the life of the reserves, you'll have a constant price that's based on the previous 12 months of actual prices of WTI. Whereas under the Canadian system, you're going to get some sort of price forecast that's going to take into account market factors, inflation, depreciation, a whole bunch of different factors. Some experts are going to try, whether it be banks, whether it be the evaluation firms, whether it be the companies internally. Somebody who understands the gas markets is going to put together a forecast that says, we think this is a reasonable approximation of what you're going to see over time. And by allowing companies to disclose the forecast price and cost, it allows you to get a better idea. The biggest impact is future development. So under constant prices and costs, especially in low price environments, people who disclose under SEC it's very challenging to get a reasonable rate of return or even a positive rate of return on undeveloped locations or anything that's capital intensive. So under forecast price and cost, you may end up with undeveloped reserves that are economic under forecast prices and costs, but if you were to apply the constant price and cost, it would become uneconomic. So on the Canadian disclosure regulations, be allowed to disclose those volumes. Under SEC, they would fall off. And so in Canada, we actually have a number of large firms that are dual listed. They're listed on the TSX stock exchange. And what they have to do to comply with the exchanges is for the Canadian stock exchange to use forecast price and cost. And for the American stock exchange, we'll run a constant price case for them. And sometimes the differences can be very material. And so, again, it goes back to that intent. The Canadian guys are saying, we want to see what's the best estimate of what do your assets look like going forward as a company. And that includes forecast price and cost because they're a more realistic picture of what the future outlook looks like. So it includes development projects that maybe not uneconomic under current conditions, but in 2 or 3 or 5 years, if we expect pricing to come back up, they may be economic and the company may be pursuing them. Under the U.S., they just say, we're not worried about whether or not it's an accurate representation of your company's future development plans. All we're concerned about is that you're using the same prices as the company beside you, and whatever assets whatever undeveloped assets that are economic under that price case, that's what they're allowed to disclose, period. So that's basically what these next couple slides are going to say. So COGI, when a location has reserves, COGI says you should look at 1P, 2P, and 3P volumes. So it may not have reserves in proved probable and possible. It may only have probable reserves. It may have proved and probable reserves. It may have proved and probable and possible reserves. But COGI says you should always consider the full gamma of uncertainty, the full spectrum of uncertainty. 1P should be evaluated to a very high level of confidence. So 1P is saying we're virtually certain or we're very certain that we're going to recover at least this volume. 2P says this is what we think we're going to get. This is our best estimate. It's equally likely that we might get more or less. And 3P has a low level of confidence. 3P is optimistic by nature and says we likely will not get as much out of the well as a 3P forecast or a property. So the SEC, again, their buckets are a bit different. The SEC, Canada really drops things into proved, probable, possible. In the U.S., you really look at proven and unproven, just the way their system is built. So probable and possible reserves generally fall into that unproven category. So they have a bit of a different take on probable and possible reserves. I'm not sure we need to spend too much time on the rest of this right now. But this is basically what we were just discussing. It's saying that because the emphasis is on 1P, it causes evaluations to be done a bit differently in the U.S. And we'll get a little bit more into that in the next couple of days. So again, just reiterating, there's a general agreement on the framework and the definitions. The application is slightly different. So the U.S. emphasis is all in the top left corner. The U.S. will not allow companies to disclose resource volumes, period. They can't put them in the public domain, so they're not even allowed to discuss them. Canada allows companies to discuss prospective contingent reserves, 1P, 2P, and 3P. So there's a little more flexibility in the Canadian system. The U.S. system just says, this is the portion of volumes that we're focused on, so this is all we're going to allow people to disclose. So just wrapping up on this first presentation. So definitions, virtually identical between all three systems. Canada, there's a direct link between the guidance and the regulatory. NI 51-101 references COE directly. In the U.S., the SEC has their own guidance and their own requirements, but in practice, most companies in the U.S. do use PRMS standards internally. Differences in the disclosure requirements can affect an evaluator's approach. That's what I was talking about, where in Canada we start with the best estimate and build our brackets around that. In the U.S., they start with proved reserves, and if they have any fits, they go from there. We were saying minor differences in the terminology or the verbiage can cause major differences in approach, and it's important to understand those differences. So when you look at 1P reserves in Canada and the U.S., they may not necessarily be equal, but because the intent is the same, there's not going to be a huge difference. The U.S. proved reserves are still, in aggregate, going to be a conservative estimate. Whether they're going to hit that P90 confidence or whether they're as conservative as the Canadian estimates is up for discussion. But because the definitions in the guidance say the same thing, it should be relatively similar.